Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the August edition of the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. I'm very happy to have all of you here this evening, both for our new and returning participants. So I want to go through a few administrative matters and announcements, and then we will spend the majority of time on our focus content tonight. And a big thanks to the team from AvePoint from presenting this evening. So just want to, for anyone who is new to our community, our mission is really to help connect network professionals who have an interest in Microsoft 365 cloud and related technologies, as well as its application within the government and public sector space. So really, this is about helping people to grow as professionals, connect solutions and innovations, and learn and continue to do all of the things that we do to support this community and in this technology space. So we have a couple of community standards. This is all stuff that should be pretty self-explanatory, but please be respectful and considerate to others. We're definitely not here to do not share any proprietary or non-public information. All of us are here in our capacity as individuals and members of this community, but not in our official capacities for Microsoft, a particular company, or even a government entity. So this is really a personal and professional community group. We certainly do encourage folks, if they have interesting information that they want to share or promote, we certainly welcome that, but we ask everyone to keep it reasonable and not be oversharing or certainly spamming anyone within the community. I would like to thank and recognize two of my co-organizers, Andrew Kagan and Andy Oak from Planet Technologies. They are a huge part of what makes these meetups a success and has allowed us to be successful throughout the last 2 years. So huge thanks to Andrew and Andy for all that they do for this community. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Nick Giard. I'm a program manager with Microsoft working with Office 365, and certainly feel free to add me on social media and reach out if you'd like to say hello or learn a little more about me. And lastly, before we hand things over to Antoine, if you're not familiar with Teams as a meeting platform, there's a few key things I'd call out. Right now, I have it moderated so that folks can mute or unmute for questions. But we would ask that folks use either the raise hand function or put something in the chat just so we don't interrupt the flow, and then we can have people unmute and ask their questions. Additionally, if you're looking for the chat option, there is a little chat bubble up in the top, and that will open up the meeting chat window, and you'll be able to put in your comments or read other comments. So if you have any other questions, feel free to put something in the chat, particularly if you need help with anything from a facilitations perspective, and myself or one of the other moderators will help try to get you taken care of. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Antoine Snow from AvePoint Technologies. Antoine, I think Jay unfortunately couldn't be here with us tonight due to a flight delay, but I feel very confident that we're in good hands. So I'll turn things over to you, and thank you so much for speaking tonight about Zero Trust with Microsoft 365.
Absolutely. And give me 1 second and get a thumbs up when you all can see my screen. All right. Thank you. Thank you. So pleasure being here today. So thank you for having me speak. And as you mentioned, Jay had a late flight back from Tampa. So he's either joining or joining late. But that being said, as mentioned, we will be speaking through zero trust and collaboration, right, within the digital workspace. So a little bit about myself. As mentioned, my name is Antoine Snow. I am a solution engineering manager and leader for AvePoint Public Sector. I do a lot of speaking around information governance, blog articles, whatever that might be as it pertains to the federal government. And I myself am a technologist and have previously been in the consulting aspect of this space as well. So been around a little bit here. And just a little bit about AvePoint, just for those of you who may not know, AvePoint Public Sector is a M365 partner, or excuse me, Microsoft partner, gold partner, who specializes and focuses on data management, information governance, lifecycle, as well as integration. So not going to spend too much time about that, but just a little bit about the organization. So I'm not going to touch too much about zero trust principles. I think for the most part, a majority of individuals understand, or who have been in the space, who understand a little bit about the order, know more or less around what zero trust is supposed to identify. Now, what I do want to focus on, and what I'll be spending the majority of this presentation discussing, is the maturity aspect of zero trust, as well as how you can leverage it in a bit more of a contextual basis, right? And that's going to be around workspace and workspace collaboration. Okay. But for those of you who may not be familiar with zero trust, or just a quick refresher, there's going to be really three core principles that it's going to center around, right? So you're going to see the assumed breach, right? So assuming breach is the idea that you minimize the damage of a potential breach by containing it with its original location and trying to prevent the movement, right? Lateral movement amongst the breach itself. There is the explicit verification, so the always verify model, right? So that's authentication, authorization, identity, having multiple points for that area as well, right? That goes down to your devices and endpoints, as well as, anything within the organization. And then lastly, and this is also going to be a very big focus of today's conversation, is going to be the least privilege aspect. All right. And the idea here is that you minimize access as well as over permissed access by using either just enough or just in time access models. Right. And in this way, what you do is you minimize the threat area based off of the individuals themselves. So that's going to be a very big focal point of tonight's conversation. Now, when we talk about the pillars of zero trust, these are going to encompass, your core pillars. So it's going to be about device and endpoint, as I just mentioned, right? Network and environment, application. You all can kind of see the rest. Now, a big number one, a big piece of this is that not everything needs to be attacked at once. The pillars of zero trust give a fantastic maturity model that you can work through as you're going through and you're checking to ensure that that your environment, that your organization is following, kind of the steps. This gives you areas to check, areas to identify, areas to remediate. Right. So the idea is not to say that everything needs to be done at once, but ultimately that this is something that you work towards as you implement a zero trust model. Now, where collaboration really fits in is this idea, this concept of workspace, right? So workspace contextualizes two key pillars of the zero trust architecture, and that's going to be around data and users, okay? And the reason being is because the workspaces, so let's define that really quickly. A workspace will then be defined as a team. A workspace can be identified as a group, as a SharePoint site collection, right? As a OneDrive. Uh, these are going to be areas that the users themselves are going to be interacting in. And so as such, what that does is it contextualizes the data itself, as well as the users who are interacting with it. And then it provides several other areas of consideration when you start talking about how to really implement a zero trust model around it. And that's going to be the life cycle, right? For anyone who is, in the record space or who understands, information life cycle is a big part of things, ensuring that data isn't existing for too long, but also ensuring that the right controls are put around how it's handled, how the disposition is handled. Permissions as an aspect. Now, permissions is very data centric, but when you start talking about permissions to data, then you have the permissions to the workspaces, potentially even disparate permissions caused by sharing or anonymous links. There is a whole other avenue that you can go down as it pertains to that itself. Ownership, the concept of ownership. If you think about a team, for instance, everyone who has access to the team, who's a member of the team, has effectively the same level of ownership across the data, right? So how do you better define this? How do you better define that ownership? How do you even define the ownership of a team itself? And I don't mean the team owner as the individual, but who it belongs to, or the purpose by which a team or site collection or a group was created, right? Delegation. We'll be focused very heavily on delegation today, as well as a little bit of policy enforcement. But going back to that concept of a least permissive model, how do you take these top level controls that exist in M365 and dummy them down to the point where an IT admin for a particular agency or component can actually do their job and do what's necessary without needing to either overtax or overpermiss, right? So the other pieces here around department landscape is going to tie into the delegation model, as well as sensitivity and how that there's a data centric aspect to it, as well as a workspace centric aspect. And there's integration points for Microsoft sensitivity labels, for instance, and where that stands. But ultimately, this is going to be the focus on collaboration that we'll be talking to very deeply today, with some of these other areas called out. So the big question, right? So how do you truly incorporate a zero trust in a free and open sharing system? That is a big question, right? And the reason being is because there is privilege that is granted to people in certain positions, right? Again, teams owners have significant capabilities or access, to change permissions, change settings, and do certain things within their environment. Site collection admin, same thing. You also have the concept of this ownership, as I mentioned before. There are access reviews that can be accomplished, but they don't cover all workspaces when you start talking about sharing. It also doesn't cover all of the sharing links when you start talking about organizations that have guest access enabled. So the idea here is that how do you address this? How do you take some of these other areas where you might want to have a better focus and truly implement a proper ZTA model, right? But you also don't want to stymie adoption. Okay, so this is the biggest aspect. When you start talking about something like zero trust, everyone goes immediately to lock it down, lock it down, lock it down. Well, on one hand, sure, right? You do have, you are working towards a bit of a model there, right? But you're now really stymieing the users themselves. Right. Ultimately, M365 is used as a tool, right, to ensure that work can get done effectively. Okay. So there has to be a balance. You can't lock everything down necessarily, or you also run the risk of people going to other disparate solutions. I have stories that I could possibly share about the way that OneDrive was locked down in a previous organization that I was a part of, and how users, in order to get their job done, decided to go to other things such as Box and Dropbox. That was not sanctioned by the organization. So now you start having this drift away from what is sanctioned, right, by the organization, and that also poses its own risk and its own problem. So you have to maintain that balance. So moving forward here, let's talk a little bit about how AvePoint sees this and how AvePoint helps to try to address this. And while there is going to be points of this that is going to speak about the technology and speak about AvePoint as an organization, I also do want to make sure that we as a group are focused on how this is a part of the zero trust model, especially the collaboration spaces that I was mentioning before. All right. So when you talk about securing the collaboration, number one is having a least privilege model for the administrators as well. One way that, let's talk about one way that I've seen some of our clients handle Teams administration, and that's by giving certain individuals ownership rights to a group of teams. Right now, there is a limit to how many you can be an owner of, or a member of, excuse me, but that also causes a couple of other issues. Number one, as a user, that administrator is now has clutter, right, as it pertains to their team's environment. But more importantly, you're not necessarily locking down access. But that was the only way without giving teams admin rights, right? So the admin center rights, that's the only way to really give that lower level permission. So let's talk about what that actually looks like or could look like in practice. Let's talk about sensitivity labels and how that can be used to identify risk for the content itself, right? And there is a security model that can coincide with that, but then how can you audit that, or how can your components or your departments audit that as well? How can you start delegating this? How can you inventory your workspaces? Make sure that it's cataloged appropriately so that you understand exactly what is happening. Metadata is key in any type of reporting mechanism when you start talking about anything, right? Let's take zero trust aside. How do you know what something was created for? Maybe you write some metadata to the property bag and you query it, or maybe you don't and you just have to ask the owner and hope that they know, right? Or in the event that you have to allocate a new owner, right, because someone left, then what do you do? So a lot of different things here around the workspace inventorying. Policy enforcement. This kind of speaks for itself. No governance no governance implementation plan, no governance document matters if you can't enforce it. I've written a governance document before, and I can tell you that no one read it other than the colleagues that I had. So I'm not sure if anyone else is in that position, but it kind of hurts, kind of stings a little bit. So the idea is that you need to have a way to enforce these things. Right? And then guest user access. That's always going to be a big one because collaboration is not just within your organization, but also extends. Many of our federal clients itself and organizations that I speak to still have this need, right, to speak with other bureaus. So how do you secure this? So we're going to talk about this through the right sizing of administration. All right. So in summary of everything that I'll be talking about today, this is kind of the synopsis, what I would want you to take away from this, right? From this section, if nothing else. The idea is that right sizing the administration would be tailoring and delegating it by service, function, and scope without having to give global permissions. So if there's nothing else that you all leave with, this concept is going to be critical and really important, right? So let's talk about a typical M365 landscape, right? In a normal model, this is how everything looks. Everything is effectively one color. Maybe not the users themselves because there's ways to identify by property, but and you could probably do that for mailboxes, but not for everything else, right? And ultimately, what ends up happening is there is a need to have some type of segregation. So when you start taking a look at your other departments and your other components, they all make up a part of the whole. All right. And some, in the case of capstone officials and things of that nature, aren't as cut and dry. It's not always cut and dry. So how do you create this appropriate segmentation? Now, there in some cases you can leverage things like administrative units, and other ways you can use things like ooh, missing it right now, but around retention labels and things like that, adaptive scopes. So there are different ways that you can try to incorporate these, but it's not holistic. So the goal here, and really how we see this, is that it's important for you to create a logical segmentation within M365 that could allow for the ability to report, apply policy, and delegate based off of these components, right? So when you talk about RBAC, right, role-based access controls, it's not necessarily just about the role. You can have several roles. What's really important here is going to be the scope delegation. How do you take a role and say, I only want you to be able to do this function against your department, right? That's really least permissive, if you think about it. So let's take a look at these containers, right? So you have personal and shared logical containers. So if you think about personal, these are the things that I was mentioning. It's fairly easy for you to establish criteria for because they leverage an Azure Active Directory property or a group membership that already exists, right? Super easy. But what about things like your site collections or your teams, right? Or your groups? Now, groups obviously being the collaborative component, not the AD property. But these are harder, right? These are harder because unless you have a naming convention associated with these, it's a lot more difficult for you to try and associate them. And that's not even talking about the ad hoc project teams that are going to be cross-component or departmental. Right? So the way that we've approached this, and now I'm speaking from the AvePoint perspective, is through the Confidence platform. Right, so the Confidence platform integrates with M365 and is able to leverage a kind of a plethora of different elements. So whether it be learning aspects or insights that we're able to pull from various different combinations of API calls and so forth, we're able to come up with this model that allows for a containerization approach. If you think about it, some people might call it virtual tenants. You might have heard that term floating around before. Whatever you want to use, the concept is the same, right? So the platform in and of itself is going to span across multiple different elements here. What we'll be focused on is going to be the control today, right? How do you control your workspaces and collaboration? How do you provide that least permissive aspect? How do you have that visibility, right? Because reporting is across all of your zero trust elements, right? Across all of the pillars. You have to maintain reporting and analytics. So how can you do that broad scale, but then also do it in a segmented way for your departments? Okay. So the way that this occurs, right, so is what we call auto discovery. And the idea behind it from a configuration perspective, and I'll walk you all through this because you won't know where to look otherwise. Out of your major services here, right, you have things like your name, which is fine, right? This is just a name that, you can consider this your department, as well as the rule. But here's going to be the biggest aspect. What are going to be the criteria that something needs to meet in order to fit that bucket, fit that model, fit that container? Okay. And you can do this across, once again, the various different services here. And the idea, or what ends up happening here, is that you have this model. And you can consider all of these to be a department, for instance, or a component. And the idea is that they are now going to be bucketed and grouped. And by bucketing and grouping these, you can now do things like delegate access and control to it. You can also do things like control how policies will be implemented. So not just your tenant level policy. No, this is policies that might need to apply for one or two of perspectives, right? So maybe you allow for external sharing or guest access as a tenant, but you have some agencies that need to be locked down, right? Maybe you want to control how users create a team or a site collection or whatever have you by department, right? Maybe you want to do a recertification. So there's a lot of maybes, right? But ultimately, the idea is that you can segment these policies. You have one that supersedes and is at the tenant level. And then as necessary, you create right-sized policies for the needs of your subsidiary organizations. All right. If anybody has any questions at any point in time, please feel free to put it in the chat as well. So that being said, this process, this concept is going to flow across all of, from our platform perspective, all of our different capabilities here. So whether you need backup and recovery for, additional redundancy, resiliency, right? Protection, whether you need to do management, which we'll dive into a little bit more, or insights, or even records delegation. I want to say in almost every conversation I've had around records management, there is a records either custodian or a records coordinator, right? That is going to be assigned to a particular area. Well, how can you better manage the records in that area? Well, do this delegated approach. Okay, and this is how it works. You use these containers, this logical segmentation, and you're able to apply it as necessary. And this really starts to echo that least permissive model now, right? But again, the workspaces is going to be this amalgamation of the data and the users. So shifting gears ever slightly, when we talk about service management now, service management for a department from a single interface is going to be pretty big and fit this model. So number one, what are we doing? So what is our platform doing? Our platform is creating a, how could we put it? How could you phrase it? Our platform is giving this this separate layer, right? So because we lay on top of M365, what we're doing is saying you can have access, you can manage your departments or your components, but your M365 credentials don't change, right? Everything that you're doing is going through our interface. It's going through our abstraction layer, right? For you to be able to take those actions. Everything's going to be audited. Everything can be adjusted. And even further, your permissions can be modified. Okay. So I'm not talking about simply saying, all right, Nick or Jay or whomever, you're now going to be the Exchange admin over your department, and you can do any and everything that you could do from the Exchange Admin Center necessarily. No, you might not need to, right? For whatever the asks are. So the idea to be able to scope, right, your controls and then scope the functions, right? Scale the functions. So your scopes here, right? And then scaling the functions themselves. So, right, being able to say, no, you don't need to be able to manage the settings, but I do want you to manage the permissions. I do need you to manage the sites and be able to create and connect to new hubs. All of these things can be done. Ooh, question here. So if person A cannot see some files because they're not in the right logical bucket, person B who has access hits share, breaks permissions, and give access to, I'm guessing you mean give access to person A still, not person B still, but if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're saying, all right, you have this segmentation, and even a segmentation of data based off of these logical containers. Sharing is still a big concern and consideration. So if you share, how does this work? So this actually lends itself to actually my next area, which is going to be insights and automation. So I'm going to answer that right now, Scott. Yep, sharing does break permissions, especially like in a Teams model or something of that nature, right? Yeah, so it has these like shadow users, people who have access from the SharePoint side, but are not present in Teams. Completely understood. So we're going to talk about that in a second here. So the next part, right? We talked about control, actionable insights. So what about your visibility? So dashboards that can be leveraged by department or whatever have you that are able to speak to these different areas, right? And what they'll do is they'll lead the administrator to be able to act on that particular information. Now, what I thought I had a screenshot of, and shame on me, is going to be exactly what you were talking about there. So the idea behind our solution from an insights perspective is that you can do two different things. Number one, those sharing permissions that you're talking about, Scott, will be surfaced. That's first and foremost. Now, there's not an easy way. If anyone is here is a SharePoint savant or whatever have you, you would know that it's not that easy to marry up in a single report, right? Who are my team members and owners? And then what are my SharePoint permissions that coincide? You would think, right, that everyone would be a part of the respective SharePoint group on the back end, but that's not always the case, not when sharing is involved. So what ends up happening? Well, what you need to end up doing, right, and actually I might have a slide here, is being able to understand some of the permissions that exist. So this might not be the right slide, but we're going to go into it. Here we go, sharing links. So what you're doing here, I'm skipping around a little bit, but what we can do here is we can actually say, all right, well, let's go ahead and talk about who has access, what are the links that are there, when was the link accessed, and do we want to take action on this, right? Now, this is going to do a couple of things. Number one, we're going to surface it to you based off of what is the identified sensitivity. This sensitivity could be identified by sensitivity label, right? Or just generally by sensitive information types or custom sensitive information types, whatever you want to use, right? We'll be able to identify it. So we'll be able to tell you because maybe it's not a big deal depending, right? So that's number one. Number two is once you've identified that and you've been able to audit the access and what someone might have done or the actions they might have taken against the content, you can remove those links. Okay, so those ellipses there would actually take you to another area where you could remove the links themselves. And that would allow you to, again, right size this or rectify the situation. But what's more important is how do you stop it from happening programmatically? And that's going to take us to something that I don't actually have a slide for because I wasn't planning to get there, but this is a great conversation, right? Which is the enforcement. So, right, so we talked about policy enforcement. The idea behind the policy enforcement is to ensure, right? And I might have lucked out there. Here we go. The idea behind policy enforcement is that you monitor, right, for that high risk activity, as we just showed, but then you also have enforcement policies that look for the settings and the permissions configuration. So if you set it, and we actually have a client that does this, they say, I don't want anyone to be able to share OneDrive, so it's not Teams related, but OneDrive content across to another agency. That is their policy for that organization. So what they've done is they're able to leverage us to create a policy that, but the thing is, right, not there are exceptions. So information barriers, while very powerful and can typically fit most organizations' needs, if there needs to be any type of exception on the service or whatever have you, right? So maybe Teams is not defined, but OneDrive is. That's really kind of where we come in. So you say, I don't want you, anyone to be able to share cross-departmentally or cross-agency from OneDrive. What we can do is go in and actually find out when that action happens, right, through monitoring the activity logs and then correct it. Right, so we'll remove that link and also shoot out an email because who goes ahead and removes links without telling people, right? Those help desk tickets will go out of control. You don't want that. So the question, can we block sharing outside of business units and organizations, but not external organizations? Absolutely, right? So that's part of the policy. What you can do is just identify exactly who you want to restrict or who you want to include. All right, so there's inclusive and exclusive policies that can be set up in order to meet that exact scenario from a policy enforcement perspective. Okay. So interestingly enough, if you guys are following chat, the questions that Scott's asking here go right in line with what I mentioned before about the need, right, at times for different agencies or whatever have you to have different policies, right? In some cases, maybe it's a tenant-wide policy with exceptions. In other cases, there might need to be an agency with exceptions. I can give you the perfect example. Any law enforcement that needs to collaborate with other law enforcement typically don't have the same policies applied to them, right? Because of that inherent need. So I think for the questions that's flowing in, and Kevin, I'll take a question in a second, but with these questions flowing in, I hope that, your minds are starting to kind of race a little bit and understand exactly how, as I'm maneuvering back through slides, how the workspace can really kind of start playing a part here, right? Because we're not just talking about the users in every instance or every circumstance. We're also talking about permissions and ensuring sharing links and things of that nature are all taken care of. We're even talking about guest user management here, right? And how they can incorporate. So question is, can you deny guest access on a team site channel or SharePoint site? Yes, you can. So you can do that natively too, right? You can, there's a lot of power depending on what you want to do, where you can deny that guest access. Now, if you also want to make sure that the admins and owners, right, can't modify that, right, because you have your tenant level settings, you have your service level settings, and then you have your workspace settings, right, because those are technically workspaces, your teams and your site collections. So depending on at what level you want to control it, we can definitely help there as well, right? So very common scenarios that you enable it from the tenant level, you might have different controls at the admin level, right? So if you think about SharePoint site collections, you can really kind of control from a SharePoint admin level what that sharing looks like. Then when you get down to the workspace level, you can start having more explicit controls, right? Depending on the purpose of this workspace, maybe I will deny access, right? If it is for financials, if it is for personnel management, maybe you want to deny any team or any site collection that has to do with those things or those agencies. Sorry, you guys probably lost audio for a second there. From guest access. So yes, that is something that we can enforce, and we can enforce it at multiple levels. It all depends on your thoughts, but that is also a native function, right? Kind of keep that in mind. All right. So wrapping up here a little bit, and please, again, feel free to throw in those questions. If I didn't answer it to your liking, you can clarify, and I'll touch on it again. But the last aspect that I want to touch on here is also going to be some of the automation that can be done, right? So there is a big element when you talk about, certain organizations with the need for PowerShell, right? And even more explicitly, the need to delegate PowerShell. And so with that being said, there are certain elements that shouldn't be as complex or necessary. And the idea here is, how do you take some of that, what we call last mile workflows, or really explicit workflows? How do you bring automation to those capabilities without actually inherently needing to run the shell, right? So what we have here are going to be dynamic workflows that are capable of running or being triggered automatically based off of something that's happening. All right. And what that allows you to do is, number one, configure that trigger event, whatever that might be, but then configure that scope. So when we talk about delegating PowerShell, ultimately that just means I'm a part of this group of users or this department or whatever have you, and I need to be able to run a PowerShell that, is executed against my area. Well, instead, by leveraging this interface, what you can do there is configure the event and the trigger, configure who it's going to impact, and then actually just kind of build that flow. And this is just an example flow, right? And this example flow is saying that when a user is created and they match a particular department, they should be added to a particular group. They should be added to a particular team. Their manager should have a calendar delegation. You could also as a part of the workflow, trigger the scripts, or excuse me, have the licensing, right? So what license should they have, right? Automatically, all of those different things. And when a user is, let's say, removed from the organization, it's the same thing. How do you want to handle reclaiming the license? How do you want to handle removing that person from all of the various different teams and site collections that they belong to, right? How do you clean up that orphaned user? These are just examples of what can be done. Now, there are also manually triggered workflows, right? And these are going to be for the people who have access to the environment, right? To our environment specifically. And in these manual workflows, it's going to be a similar process, right? Where you can dictate the type or the object that you want to act against, and then you can build out the workflow. And in this case, this is going to be MFA settings. You can also do suspicious activities, right? There's different things that can happen here, but ultimately it's just trying to take that complexity away from PowerShell. PowerShell delegation, take away the necessity for the service account, right? To create a service account for someone or some group of people to use in certain instances, right? If they're not trusted individuals, there's a lot of risk that occurs there. So once again, it's just trying to minimize that risk in a zero trust model through the least permissive areas. So with that being said, I have some other slides here, but not a whole lot of other kind of meaty bits of content. So I want to make sure that if there are any other questions around this concept of delegation, around containerization, or virtual tenancy, however you want to call that, or specific functions or features or capabilities in this model, or even Microsoft integration, right? Please feel free to ask those questions. We do have a lot of other capabilities and ways to augment and bring to light other functions, right, to try to make this easier. So that being said, I'll go ahead and pause. And if there aren't any questions, will this fight with anything in place with Purview? Great question there, Scott. So no, the idea is not to fight or battle anything with Purview. The idea actually is to try to, number one, minimize how many individuals need to have direct access to Purview. Now, of course, there are roles, right? Going back to the role part of the conversation, right? There's roles that you can have within Purview, but there's not necessarily a scope. So what we're trying to do is add the scope to that in order to still bring some of the functionality there. Now, anything that's a tenant level function or tenant level policy that's configured through Purview will still reign supreme. But once again, it's how do you say, I'm a records manager and I need to be able to do my own disposition approval, right, in a multi-step capacity. Well, you have retention labels configured and you might have other areas of that configured within Purview, but some of those things aren't completely possible, right? So how do we augment some of that to make, the elements of Purview more form-fitting for business applications and business use? So I hope that clarified. If a label allows sharing, but in trust does not, does it allow it? Just wondering if you should set up Purview or not if you have it. So that's a great question. So let's talk about the labels a little bit, right? So labels are going to be applied where? Two different places, right? You could apply it to certain workspaces, and you can also apply the label to the content. And then from there, right, labels to the workspace don't apply it to the content. So there's that. But if you're applying it to the content, what are you defining? Well, you're defining some level of classification, sensitivity. You're defining access, or you are allowing users to define that access. Depending on how sensitivity labels are configured, though, they can also be changed or modified, right? So ultimately, the question becomes how sensitive, or should I say, how stringent is that content? My recommendation is always to make sure sensitivity labels are applied to strict content, right? Content that it should be. That being said, for the majority of your content, policies around the workspace itself can suffice. In other areas, you still have sensitivity labels applied to the content. You have policy enforcement for the workspace. In some cases, there's need to know, right? So I think everyone here is federal or some semblance of it. So you understand the concept that just seeing things sometimes is actually more than enough. So having access to a workspace is one thing, but what about the content itself, right? So my ultimate answer to you is that it really depends how you want to configure it and architect it. We could talk about it at length, but they do complement each other, right? And at the very least, if you don't use the policy enforcement, the insights reporting that we have around how sensitivity labels are used in your environment is also going to be very useful. All right. So great questions. Great questions. Thank you. All right. So that being said, I guess Nick, I can pass it back over to you. That's going to be the burn of the conversation. I hope this is very helpful, just in general. If it's not just capabilities itself, but also just kind of the thought process, right, around how we think through this, how workspaces play a part in it, especially when you talk about collaboration, because ultimately we don't want your users to go astray. So that being said, I want to thank you all. I want to thank Nick for putting me in this position to be able to present. I want to thank all the other co-sponsors, and yeah, I'll hang around here for a few minutes.
Yeah, Antoine, thank you so much for. I mean, I thought that was a great presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I didn't know a lot about your guys' capability before, and looks like some compelling functionality. So, if there aren't any other questions specifically for Antoine, if there's any other topics that folks want to discuss or ask about, or as we're all gathered here, feel free to put that in the chat or come off mute. And otherwise, thank you for attending and have a great evening.